Hey Wargamers, today we're going to continue our 2019 update series by talking about this guy. That's right, we are finally talking about the Riptide. It is a staple unit that has been in a lot of competitive lists since the Codex was released. And it brings a little bit of everything to the table, or rather a lot of everything to the table, and that's why you still see it today. The Riptide itself hasn't changed very much since the Codex was released, but instead the Codex has changed around the Riptide. And so today we're going to talk about its strengths, its weaknesses, and how it compares to some of those newer, more popular choices, and exactly how you want to use your Riptide in your Tau army. So before we get into that, I want to say thanks for watching. If you like this video, go ahead and hit subscribe. That way you won't miss any of my upcoming content. Okay, so let's start off by taking a look at its basic stat line and some of its special rules. At full health, a Riptide has movement 12, weapon skill 5 up, ballistic skill 4 up, strength 6, toughness 7, wounds 14, 4 attacks, 8 leadership, and a 2 up save, with movement, ballistic skill, and attack scaling down as it takes damage. The stats that really stand out there are his movement, which is 12, so it allows you to both move aggressively to capture objectives and put pressure on your enemy, but also react to enemy movements. You can stay away from enemies that are going to charge you with a movement of 12, whereas lesser movements make that more challenging. Also, his toughness and wound characteristics mean that a Riptide can take a lot of damage. There's a lot of durability just built in there, and that's amplified by his 2-up save, which is, good, right? A 2-up save is never a bad thing for a model, especially something that is packing as much firepower as a Riptide. You want to keep it alive, and having that 2-up save is something that is not common in the Tau Codex. So this is one of your more durable units right off the bat because of that. As far as special rules go, he has For the Greater Good, like most Tau do. He also has Riptide Shield Generator, which gives him a 5-up invulnerable save. This makes that 2-up save all the more better, right? Having that reliable 5-up backup is pretty good. So we have a 2-up, 5-up, not bad. Kind of the signature ability of the Riptide is the Nova Reactor. This allows you to Nova charge in the movement phase. It doesn't have to be at the beginning, doesn't have to be at the end. It can be any time during the movement phase. You take a mortal wound, and in exchange for taking that mortal wound, you can select one of 3 options. You can either improve your invulnerable save to be a 3-up, so now instead of being a 2-up, 5-up, you are a 2-up, 3-up. This is something that is really good if you are, expecting to take a lascan to the face. Having that 3-up save is really important in that context. Additionally, you can use this ability to boost and move 2d6 inches in the charge phase, even if you are not declaring a charge. This is something that you would do if you want to capture an objective at the end of the game, or just get out of dodge and avoid getting charged yourself. So having this ability gives you some tactical flexibility, but really the thing that you're going to choose most often is the Nova Charge ability, which moves your Heavy Burst Can to be Heavy 18 instead of Heavy 12, and moves your Ion Accelerator to be Heavy 6. So overall, this is a choice that you're going to choose 9 times out of 10. Improving your Heavy Burst Can to be Heavy 18 is really critical. It gives you a 50% increase in damage output, and therefore a 50% increase in the efficiency of your model, which for a model that you're investing this much points into and that can do this much damage is pretty considerable. So doing the Nova Charge is going to be your default option most of the time. You can pay 1 command point and use the Branch Nova Reactor Stratagem that allows you to pick 2 of the 3 options instead of just 1. In most cases, you're going to pick the offensive, the Nova Charge ability, and then also improve your invulnerable save in the case that you don't have drones to take Seer Protocols for you or anything like that. So, primarily focusing on using this ability to improve his damage output, but in cases where you don't have drones around or he's particularly vulnerable, you might want to consider paying that Branch Nova Charge and taking the invulnerable save as well. It's not something that you have to do every turn. It's not something that you should feel obligated to do. There are plenty of times where I felt obligated to do it and have completely wasted that ability. So it's not something that you need to do every turn, but it is a really fantastic tool to have at your disposal. And so remember that you have access to that stratagem. All right, so let's talk about some of the options you have with the Riptide, starting with a primary weapon. On one hand, you have the Heavy Burst Cannon, and on the other, you have the Ion Accelerator. Both of these are, pretty powerful weapons, but overall, you're going to want to go with this guy with the Heavy Burst Cannon. It just has a really good rate of fire with a respectable stat line. It makes it the kind of a default choice for most enemy types. It's going to be able to take care of knights. It's going to be able to take care of mass infantry. Either way, the heavy burst cannon is going to be able to deliver damage. So really, it's the most versatile and reliable option that you can pick as far as a primary weapon is concerned. For secondary weapons, you're also going to want to go with what I have here, which is the Smart Missile System. Again, good rate of fire, good range, and most importantly, it ignores cover and does not require line of sight. So a pretty unique weapon as far as the arsenal is concerned, and really just gives you a good amount of flexibility. So heavy burst cannon, Smart Missile System, same as it's always been. These are the weapons that you're going to want to choose. For support systems, though, things get a little bit more interesting. In the past, I have routinely recommended the Target Lock and Advanced Targeting System because Target Lock allows you to move and shoot without penalty. And in that scenario, I view the Riptide as being a very mobile, kind of cagey unit. The Advanced Targeting System additionally is there to just give you a little extra oomph. It makes your Smart Missile Systems -1. It improves the AP on your Heavy Burst Cannon as well. So you're really kind of in that sweet spot of AP with both your weapons. And that is extremely valuable. Now, in contrast to that, the meta today relies heavily on having Shadow Sun as part of your list, or if not, just really focusing on kind of a Cao Yun strategy. And so having Shadow Sun in your list where she calls Cao Yun twice means that your Riptide is likely not going to be moving for half the game. And with that in mind, the Target Lock kind of loses its value, right? If you're not moving, then why do you need a target lock? So in that scenario, especially if you're bringing Shadow Sun, I think the Velocity Tracker becomes a much more viable option. The Velocity Tracker improves your ballistic skill against things with the fly keyword. Fly is pretty prevalent. It's not ubiquitous. You're not going to use it all the time, but you're probably going to use it more often than you would a target lock if the Riptide is going to be standing still. So I think the Velocity Tracker is actually a more viable choice now than it was when the Codex came out. And so now I think the secondary system or the support system loadout is a little bit more army list dependent, especially if you bring Shadow Sun. Velocity Tracker seems more realistic and valuable than a target lock some of the time. So that's one of the big changes in my perspective on the Riptide over the past, however long it's been. So that's a big change there. As far as sept choices go, we have the option of taking any sept, of course, but really the ones that benefit the Riptide the most are Tau Sept. The Riptide is going to do a really nice amount of damage with supporting fire or with For the Greater Good. And then he's also going to do well in Borkan because all of his weapons are heavy. So being able to have a little bit further reach with Borkan is going to be beneficial. But really, the Riptide is just a good unit all around, and the sept choice doesn't make a huge difference one way or another. Things that I would avoid, with the Riptide, Vior La doesn't really benefit the Riptide, and Farsight also doesn't make a huge difference because the Riptide is generally going to be further away. But Riptides in Farsight Enclaves, particularly if you're thinking about like Ovesa, not a bad thing, right? It's just not necessarily as good as Tau or Borkan. So the final option that we have with Riptides are drones. You have the option of taking shield missile drones. Don't do it. They're way too expensive. And just don't take drones with the Riptide, actually. If you are bringing drones with your Riptide, like in your list, they should be as their own separate unit for two reasons. And we've talked about these in other videos before, but basically, if you just bring 2 drones with your Riptide, that's easy kill points. And really, we are going to want more than 2 drones anyway. So bringing a big blob of shield drones with a tactical drone slot is really the way to go. So skip the drones, bring drones as their own separate unit instead, and you will be much happier. So as I mentioned before, the biggest change to the Riptide is not the Riptide itself, it's the army that surrounds the Riptide. And we've talked about a few nuances to that, but really what's important about the Riptide is how it compares to some of your other choices. One of those choices is going to be Crisis Suits. Crisis Suits still have you know, a lot of issues, but they are more viable than they were in the past. Particularly if we're looking at things like fusion blaster suits or cyclic ion blaster suits, they do compare pretty favorably with a Riptide in terms of damage output per point. The weaknesses of Crisis suits, though, are their durability and their ability to reach the target. So really what we're looking at the Riptide for in terms of comparison here is a slightly lower point efficiency at taking out some targets, but instead you're gaining durability, mobility, and a lot easier ability to buff this unit compared to Crisis suits with something like Shadow Sun or any other commander. It's much easier to use your Master of War ability and your stratagems like Command and Control node on a Riptide than it is on a unit of Crisis suits, because the Riptide is going to deploy in your line and you can have a little bit better control over where your Riptide is positioned relative to those buffing units. So there's something to be said just for that. I think that type of pre-planning, that strategy is really valuable and something that the Riptide facilitates by being kind of one-man army in a lot of ways. An additional comparison that we're going to make is against Broadsides. Broadsides are essentially, you know, glass cannons. They have a fair amount of durability, but not as much as the Riptide does. The high-yield missile pod Broadside is going to be much more points efficient than a Riptide or Crisis suits against pretty much any target. And so these guys are going to be really efficient damage dealers. Now, the thing is that they're much more reliant on sufficient drone support in order to stay on the table. You need a ton of drones to keep Broadsides alive. You need fewer drones to keep a Riptide alive because it has that higher toughness characteristic, and it also has that built-in invulnerable save, which can be improved to 3-up, which is pretty darn good. So overall, I think you look at the army compositions that you see today, and there's definitely a larger broadside component. Broadsides are going to be less mobile. They're like purely a gunline unit. If you're looking at how to use Broadsides versus Riptides, Riptides are much more dynamic, whereas Broadsides are pretty static. And so that's the trade-off there. Finally, the trade-off between using some of the Forge World variants of Riptide, like a Yvara and a Riptide, the Riptide just blows those out of the water. It used to be that the Yvara was a really solid choice, if not risky, really, you know, point efficient in terms of the damage that it can do. But the way the Riptide is kitted now is just a much better choice. You know, taking 2 Riptides compared to 1 Yvara, 2 Riptides are going to win. Last but not least, I want to mention a few different stratagems that the Riptide can use. There's kind of a checklist that I go through when I'm using Riptide in terms of figuring out what stratagems I want to use. At the beginning of the turn, I think, okay, what is the condition of my Riptide? Do I need to stimulant injector it to make it function as if it had full wounds? If it's not at full wounds, or if it's close to a threshold, do I want to automated repair system it to give it back a couple wounds and maybe jump up a damage tier or a health tier? And then I look at its damage output. Do I want to command and control node it to improve its damage capabilities, or do I want to use that command and control node on something else like a unit of Broadsides? And then finally, I look at its branch Nova Charge and see, does this thing have drones? If it doesn't have drones, I'm going to branch in order to boost its invulnerable save. And so kind of that checklist of going through those different stratagems is going to be really important. Overall, Riptide's a fantastic unit. It's going to do a lot of work for you. Lists that include 3 Riptides are not uncommon, and they do well. Really, you're going to want to run these guys as part of your gun line with a heavy burst cannon, smart missile system, advanced targeting system, and then either a velocity tracker or target lock, depending on the rest of your list. But they are going to do a fair amount of damage for you. Again, Riptides are still a staple unit and do very well in most lists. So let me know what you think in the comments below. How do you use your Riptide? And of course, happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. This channel is made possible by my supporters over on Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, consider joining our community over there and the associated Discord channel. Special thanks to Aaron Fox, Shifty, Jim Bob, Scott Heater, Nick Steele, Jared Egler, Tao Oswell, Zach Brooks, Stephen Cohen, Jake Johnson, Eric Jackson, Zealous Brimstone, Evan Wells, Benjamin, Julian Peck, Giovanni DiMaggio, and Chris Kessler.